It was just another typical lunch hour in Charleston, South Carolina. The downtown diner, bustling with the chatter of locals and the clink of silverware, was filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling burgers. The cozy atmosphere wrapped itself around the room like a familiar embrace, far removed from the chaos of the outside world. For many of the patrons, this place was a haven, a space to relax, enjoy a warm meal, and share idle conversations. Through the door, a young man stepped in, his presence barely noticeable at first. He was in his late 20s, wearing a simple gray hoodie and jeans, the scuffs on his boots hinting at a long day's labor at a nearby construction site. His hunger and fatigue were evident, he was just looking for a quick bite before heading back to the grind. But the moment he approached the counter, everything changed. The hum of conversations seemed to quiet, the air thickening with an unspoken tension. The waitress, a woman in her 50s, stood behind the counter. Her tight-lipped smile did little to mask the sharpness in her eyes. Without so much as a greeting, she fixed her gaze on him, lingering a moment too long. "You're gonna need to pay up front," she said, her voice cool and indifferent. Calvin blinked, taken aback. He wasn't sure if he had heard her correctly. "I'm sorry, what?" "I said, you need to pay before you order," she repeated, louder this time, her tone leaving no room for argument. The few conversations still taking place in the diner fell silent, and Calvin noticed a few heads turning in his direction. A quick glance around revealed that none of the other patrons had been asked to do the same. His heart began to race, but he fought to keep his composure. He looked back at the waitress, trying to mask his confusion with calm. "Is that policy?" She shrugged, her eyes dropping to the counter. "Just the way we do things sometimes." The silence around him grew heavier. It was as though the entire diner had become a stage, and Calvin had unwittingly stepped into a scene that he didn't want to be a part of. There were the old man sipping his coffee in the corner booth, the mother with her kids by the window, the businessman scrolling on his phone near the entrance. No one said a word, but the weight of their gaze was unmistakable. Calvin's stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from the humiliation that gnawed at him. He knew exactly why he was being singled out, but what choice did he have? He couldn't make a scene, not here, not now. "All right," he muttered, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled $20 bill and handed it over. "I'll have the meatloaf special." The waitress took the money without a word, slapping a receipt onto the counter before turning away. Calvin took the slip of paper, his appetite gone in an instant. He found an empty table in the corner and sank into the chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. The clatter of conversations picked up again, but he could still feel the occasional eyes drifting his way. But Calvin wasn't the only one who had noticed. At the table next to his sat an older woman, her sharp eyes watching him intently. She had seen everything. She folded her hands over her coffee cup, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. She didn't need to look up to know what had just happened, and as she observed Calvin, the flicker of something more than mere curiosity passed through her. She had seen enough. What would she do, though? Calvin, for his part, tried to ignore the situation. He kept his head down, pretending to scroll through his phone, though his mind was far from focused. The sting of the moment settled deeper, and though he tried to brush it off, the weight of it hung over him like a heavy coat. Every glance felt like a spotlight. Every whisper a judgment. The waitress passed by with a tray of steaming plates, her expression unreadable. She didn't glance his way, but the echo of her earlier words lingered in the air, souring the room. Calvin exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking. This wasn't new. He had been in situations like this before, where the sting of prejudice or discomfort was familiar, but today? Today, it stung deeper. At the table beside him, Elaine, the older woman, sipped her coffee, her eyes flicking between Calvin and the waitress. She was retired, a former school teacher who had spent her afternoons here, slowly sipping decaf and working through crossword puzzles. But in this moment, she was caught, gripped by something she couldn't ignore. She had seen enough injustice in her lifetime to recognize it where it reared its ugly head, and what had just unfolded. It was ugly, unfair, and unnecessary. She leaned back in her chair, the crossword puzzle forgotten, her thoughts turning over the conversation she had just witnessed. The knot of frustration in her chest grew tighter. She didn't know Calvin, but she recognized that something wasn't right. She didn't have to know him to see the wrongness in the waitress's actions. It wasn't just about paying up front. It was about the way the waitress had treated him, like he was less than the others, undeserving of the same courtesy. As Calvin's meal arrived, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, Elaine's attention snapped back to the room. The other diners had returned to their conversations, their focus shifting away. It was easy for them to ignore what had just happened, to pretend it was nothing. Easier to let it pass as if it didn't matter. But to Elaine, it did matter. She stirred her coffee absently, her fingers tapping against the ceramic, her mind churning. She had spent her life teaching her students to stand up for what was right. She had taught them to speak out against wrongs, no matter how small. But here she was, doing nothing. The irony wasn't lost on her. Calvin, meanwhile, quietly picked at his food, his movements slow, each bite heavier than the last. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the sting of shame and the fire of quiet anger. Every glance in his direction felt like an accusation. Every whisper seemed to rip open a fresh wound. He wanted to leave, to flee the judgment that filled the room. But something held him there. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was exhaustion. Elaine set her mug down. The decision had been made. She pushed her chair back, the sound of it cutting through the hum of conversation. A few nearby customers took notice. Without hesitation, she grabbed her purse and walked toward the counter, her steps purposeful, her gaze unwavering. What she was about to do would change everything. Calvin's gaze remained fixed on his plate, his face tight with tension. The room, once filled with the low hum of conversations, fell into an eerie stillness. It was as though the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, hanging heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Then, a voice sliced through the silence, sharp and determined. A younger man near the door stood up abruptly, his button-up shirt slightly askew. "She's right," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness with a clarity that grabbed everyone's attention. "I've been coming here for months, and I've never seen anyone ask to pay up front. What happened just isn't okay." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room as heads nodded in agreement. The waitress looked around, her defensiveness crumbling under the weight of the collective gaze of the room. Calvin, still seated at his table, felt something shift within him, something subtle yet profound. He lifted his eyes for the first time since entering, meeting Elaine's gaze. A wave of gratitude washed over him, quiet but unmistakable. He gave her a small nod, almost imperceptible, his silent thank you carrying more weight than words ever could. The waitress took a step back, her hands trembling slightly. "Look, I didn't mean to cause trouble," she stammered, her voice unsteady. "Maybe I shouldn't have done that." Elaine wasn't letting her off the hook. "It's not about avoiding trouble," she said, her voice firm. "It's about treating people with the respect they deserve." The room simmered with tension, but as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the issue ran deeper than just one moment. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a reflection of something far more ingrained, something that no one in that room could ignore any longer. The air thickened with the unspoken truth, a truth that lingered like a shadow, hanging over every conversation. The waitress, now visibly uncomfortable, fidgeted with the hem of her apron, unsure whether to stand her ground or retreat entirely. More customers began to murmur in agreement with Elaine, their voices rising in quiet solidarity. Calvin, still seated at his table, felt a flood of emotion stir within him, relief, yes, but also frustration. Frustration that this moment had even needed to happen. He pushed his plate aside, the food suddenly unappetizing, and stood. His movements were deliberate, drawing the eyes of every diner in the room. "I'm not here to cause a scene," Calvin said, his voice calm but steady, filled with a quiet intensity. "I just came for lunch." "But what happened today? It's not about the money, or even the food. It's about how you made me feel, like I didn't belong here. Like I had to prove something just to sit down and eat." His words hung in the air like an echo, a sentiment that struck a chord with the customers, who now listened intently. The room was still, the weight of his honesty settling in with them. Elaine turned back to the waitress, her expression softening slightly. "You hear that?" she asked. "This isn't about you being a bad person. It's about taking responsibility for your actions and understanding how they affect others." The waitress hesitated, her defenses crumbling under the weight of the moment. She looked at Calvin, her voice barely a whisper now. I'm sorry," she murmured, her eyes flicking around the room, as if searching for something, anything, to ground her in this uncomfortable reality. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." Calvin studied her, his face unreadable, the sting of the moment still there. After a pause, he gave a small nod. "Apology accepted," he said simply. His tone was calm, but there was no hiding the hurt that still lingered in his words. But the moment wasn't over. The man in the button-up shirt spoke up again, his voice strong, carrying an urgency that filled the room. "This isn't just about one person apologizing," he said. "It's about recognizing that this happens all the time. Not just here, but everywhere. We all need to do better." The room went quiet again, the weight of his words sinking in, one by one. Elaine nodded in agreement, adding, "It's not enough to just be sorry. Change has to follow." At that moment, the manager of the diner appeared from the back, clearly alerted by the commotion. He was a wiry man in his 40s, his face drawn with worry as he assessed the scene before him. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his voice sharp but cautious. Elaine didn't miss a beat. "What's going on," she said, her tone unwavering, "is that your waitress just discriminated against this young man. And we're all trying to figure out if that's how you run your business." The manager's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing his face as he glanced between Elaine, Calvin, and the waitress. I'm so sorry," he stammered. "That's not our policy. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Elaine crossed her arms, her expression stern. "It shouldn't take a public confrontation for you to notice what's happening under your roof," she said firmly. "This isn't just about one employee. It's about the environment you've allowed." The manager nodded, clearly chastened. "You're right," he said, his voice subdued. "I'll address it. I'll make changes. Thank you for bringing this to my attention." Calvin, finally breaking his silence, spoke again, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "All I want is to be treated like anyone else," he said, his words simple but loaded with meaning. "That's it. If you can promise me that, then maybe this place really can change." The manager nodded solemnly. "You have my word," he said, the weight of his promise hanging in the air. The waitress, still standing behind the counter, looked at Calvin with a mixture of regret and reflection. "I'll do better," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As Calvin left the diner that day, the sun hit his face, the warmth on his skin offering a strange comfort after the tension inside. He took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. He wasn't sure if things would really change, not in that diner, or anywhere else. But one thing was certain, someone had stood up for him today, and that mattered. Back inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Elaine returned to her seat, her coffee now lukewarm. The other diners exchanged quiet glances, their conversation subdued, the weight of the situation still hanging in the air. The waitress stood at the counter, her gaze fixed on the cash register as though it held the answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. Her actions had been called out, and though it stung, a part of her understood the necessity of it. She thought about Calvin's words, about how she had made him feel, and for the first time, she truly understood the weight of what she had done. The manager, still standing near the counter, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "All right, folks," he said, his voice addressing the room. "I want to apologize for what happened today. That's not who we are, and it's not who we want to be. I promise to make changes so this doesn't happen again." The diners nodded silently, some offering small words of agreement. Elaine gave a slight smile, satisfied that her voice had made a difference, even if it was just a small step. Later that evening, as Calvin sat on the porch with his younger sister, he recounted the experience. He spoke of Elaine, of the man who had spoken up, and of the strange mix of shame and empowerment he had felt throughout the ordeal. "You think they'll really change?" his sister asked, resting her chin on her hands. Calvin shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe. Maybe not. But if we don't call it out when it happens, nothing ever will." Back in the diner, Elaine stayed a little longer than usual, finishing her crossword puzzle. She reflected on the day, knowing that while she couldn't change the world, moments like this, moments when someone chose to act rather than stay silent, could create ripples that traveled further than anyone realized. And that was enough for her. The next day, the diner posted a sign on the front door, "We welcome everyone and are committed to fairness and respect for all." It wasn't much, but it was a start. For Calvin, for Elaine, and for everyone who had witnessed that day, the message was clear: standing up for what's right, even in the smallest moments, can make a difference. Change starts with courage. And sometimes, that courage is enough to spark something bigger.